Right now from Rick's Firearm Academy of Detroit. Rick Ector is with us on the program. Rick, how are you, sir?
Hey, man, I was just talking with Kyle. You know, with the exception of last night's football game, I'm doing just fine, man.
Well, listen, I am glad that you were with us today. I was reading a piece in the Washington Post by Philip Bump. Came out yesterday afternoon. Gun control opponents love to cite Chicago, so how does it compare to the rest of America? Philip Bump, Rick, wrote a lot of words to come to the conclusion that, yes, Chicago is a very violent city and far more violent than the United States. But one of the things that he brought up was, Detroit. Detroit is really violent, too. So it's not just Chicago. And, last year he said the non-fatal shooting rate, 154.9 incidents for every 100,000 Detroit residents, double Chicago's rate. So let me ask you this, Rick. Would you rather live in Detroit or in Chicago?
If we're talking about from a violence perspective, I would definitely choose to live here, home in Detroit, for a variety of reasons. The most ostensible reason is that are definitely because our gun laws are definitely better with respect to law-abiding citizens protecting themselves. Detroit, hands down. You know, the thing that I find particularly interesting is that, in the aftermath of the unfortunate incident that occurred, on the community college campus in Oregon, the president came out on one of his press conferences in the aftermath, and he stated, every place where we, have tough gun laws, we have, less violent crime or less violence. And, it seemed rather curious that the place that he used to live for a number of years, Chicago, which is, of course, the topic of this article, he failed to mention. Chicago has historically had tough gun laws. And the things that we say all the time, which is definitely true, is that criminals, for whatever reason, they don't obey the law. And that's the thing that I find that most gun control advocates really have the toughest time in getting through their skulls. I was on a local program here a couple of nights ago, and they were talking about mental health checks. Even if you played devil's advocate and you said, okay, if for whatever reason, such a thing ever came to fruition, what would stop a person who flunked a mental health check from getting access to a gun criminally? And you know what? Nothing. There's nothing to stop a bad guy with bad thoughts in his mind and in his heart to commit, these heinous offenses. And I guess the thing about the article is that they went to great pains to talk about mass shootings and see how mass shootings compare in Chicago versus the rest of the place. I can't think of a bigger sense of hypocrisy on full display when we totally just ignore homicides and murders that happen on a routine daily basis, across our country, and all of a sudden they want to focus on mass shootings, which fortunately, in a sense, are still relatively rare, across the country. But it seems to be a very poor argument that's being made for advocates of gun control. And the thing is, when they want to compare Chicago and Detroit, compared to other cities across the country, generally speaking, in our largest cities across America, the largest cities typically have the most stringent, most form of draconian gun laws on the books. So I really have a hard time explaining, where they're trying to go with their argument that they laid out in the post that was printed the other day.
Well, I think, look, when you start to slice and dice the data, and we're gonna look at what Philip Bump called mass shootings in Chicago as opposed to violent crime. Most of us, Rick, and I'm guessing this is true of the folks who come to get firearm training from you. It's not that they would prefer to be carjacked or kidnapped by somebody using a particular inanimate object over another, right? They would prefer not to be a victim of a carjacking, not to be the victim of a home invasion in the first place. So when we're talking about all of these variations and shadings of violent crime, why don't we just talk about violent crime?
Well,
And
then that doesn't give them the opportunity to vilify their favorite inanimate object. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I could care less how I'm victimized. I'd just rather not be victimized. And by the same token, I would love to have the ability, which is another theme I harp on all the time, to lawfully defend myself. And we looked at, if we just talked about murders, homicides that are occurring, I was just pulling up stats, looking at some of the bigger cities. I mean, there's increases in homicides in places like Chicago, New York, Washington, Baltimore, St. Louis, Milwaukee, Dallas, Philadelphia, all across the map. But curiously enough, in the city of Detroit, we're actually experiencing a downward trend in homicides. And I don't want to take, too much thunder away from the great job our Chief James Craig has been doing, in a year and a half, almost 2 years he's been on the job. But even he has credited law-abiding citizens lawfully carrying firearms has been a significant decrease in violence, particularly in homicides and other statistics all across the board. So, I welcome the spotlight that they want to, showcase Detroit, because there are some things here that we have in Detroit that's worth talking about. We actually have the right to carry firearms in Michigan, whether it's in Detroit or whether it's in the Upper Peninsula. And it's having a positive effect on the decrease of violent crime here.
Talking with Rick Ector, Rick's Firearm Academy. And, that's the thing, Rick, as well as I do that what causes crime to go up, what causes crime to go down, really can't be boiled down to a bumper sticker or, a slogan. I mean, there are a lot of things going on that are unique to Detroit. There are a lot of things going on, I think, that are unique to the high crime areas in Chicago where we are seeing such endemic violence. And in Detroit, one of the things that you describe, I think, is perhaps a turnaround that is taking place. You have, and I don't know how big a group of residents it is as a proportion to the city, but it's pretty clear, Rick, that there are a core group of Detroit residents who don't want to see their city die, who want to see a resurgence and a renaissance of their city, and they're committed to making that happen.
Yeah, and, unfortunately, we've had our share of challenges, fiscally, financially with regards to the bankruptcy, but there's a hardcore, amount of citizens here who are not going to leave the city. They're not going to give up on the city. They're staying here, and we're doing the best we can to ameliorate some of the ills that we have to actually entice more people to move into the city. But one of the things that we have in our favor, man, is that you have the right to protect yourself, and you have the tools to effectively do that. And those of us that are still here, those of us who are not going anywhere, we're glad that we're here to help fight for our city. And as you can attest through the many times we've been on the show to talk about some of the positive self-defense stories that come out of Detroit, citizens are totally fed up with crime, and we're willing to protect ourselves and protect our families. And we're going to stay here, and we're going to help make Detroit be the city we believe it can be.
Well, listen, Rick, we appreciate you coming on the program today, sir. It's always a pleasure talking with you, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Always my pleasure. Look forward to seeing you guys real soon at the next annual meeting in Kentucky.
Yes, sir. We will see you there.
Yes.
Rick Ector with us here on NRA News, Cam and Company.